I stared at the contract spread out on the desk, my signature still wet on the dotted line. The Antarctic Research Foundation letterhead looked official, almost comically so against the backdrop of my nearly empty apartment. 6 months at Whitmore Research Station, just me, scientific equipment, and the endless white. "You're absolutely sure about this, Maurice?" Sophia asked, sliding the contract into a folder. My supervisor's concern was evident in the slight furrow of her brow. "I need the change," I said, adjusting my glasses. "After everything with Karen, the divorce papers, the house." I stopped myself, not wanting to rehash the collapse of my marriage again. "The isolation will be good for my research." Sophia nodded, though her expression suggested she wasn't convinced. "The station's been upgraded recently. You'll have all the equipment you requested, plus satellite communications for weekly check-ins. Just remember, no extraction until the scheduled pickup date unless there's a medical emergency." 6 months of uninterrupted work sounds perfect, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. 3 weeks later, I stood in my bedroom, packing the last of my personal items. The divorce had at least made this part easier. I didn't own much anymore. I folded another thermal shirt and placed it in my duffel bag next to stacks of books, notebooks, and a photo of my parents I couldn't bring myself to leave behind. My phone buzzed with a text from the transport company. "Helicopter departing in 90 minutes. Please confirm arrival at pickup location." I typed a quick confirmation and zipped up my bag. The apartment looked bare, most of my possessions either sold or stored. Karen had taken almost everything in the settlement. 6 months in Antarctica suddenly seemed like the perfect distance from my old life. The helicopter pad was on the outskirts of McMurdo Station, the wind whipping across the tarmac as I approached with my bags. A stocky man with a reddish-brown beard was doing a pre-flight check around a white and blue helicopter. "Joshua Hansen," he said when he saw me, extending a calloused hand. His grip was firm, his blue eyes quickly sizing me up. "You must be Dr. Chen." "Maurice," I corrected, setting down my bags. "Just Maurice is fine." He nodded once. "Ever been in a helicopter before?" "Once, years ago. Tourist trip over the Grand Canyon." Joshua gave a short laugh. "This'll be different. We've got about 4 hours of flight time ahead of us. Weather report shows clear skies, but things change fast down here." He helped me load my bags into the storage compartment. "Got your cold weather gear? Once we're at Whitmore, there's no running to the store if you forgot something." I patted my insulated jacket. "Everything on the list?" "Good." He gestured toward the helicopter. "Let's get moving then." The interior was cramped, filled with equipment and supplies. I buckled into the passenger seat while Joshua went through his final checks, speaking into his headset in aviation terminology I didn't follow. The rotors started with a whine that built to a roar, and then we were lifting off, McMurdo Station shrinking beneath us. Through the headset, Joshua's voice came clearly despite the noise. 4-hour flight. Try to enjoy the view. It's one of the most untouched places on Earth. Below us, the landscape transformed from the rocky outcroppings of McMurdo to vast stretches of white, broken occasionally by jagged mountain peaks. The sun reflected off the snow with an intensity that made me glad for my sunglasses. I'd seen photos, read descriptions, but nothing prepared me for the sheer emptiness of Antarctica, beautiful and terrifying in its vastness. "That's the Transantarctic mountain range," Joshua pointed out after we'd been flying for about 2 hours. "Whitmore is on the other side, about 90 miles from the nearest neighboring research station." 90 miles? I asked, suddenly struck by what that distance meant in this environment. "Yep. You'll be the only person within a day's travel in good weather. In bad weather," he shrugged. "Well, you won't be going anywhere." The reality of my isolation began to sink in as we continued flying. The landscape below seemed to go on forever, an endless expanse of white, occasionally broken by dark rock. Joshua fell silent, focused on his instruments in the horizon, leaving me alone with my thoughts. By the time Joshua announced we were approaching Whitmore, my back was stiff from sitting, and my mind was crowded with second thoughts. The station came into view, a cluster of low, prefabricated buildings connected by covered walkways, painted bright red against the white landscape for visibility. "There she is," Joshua said. "Home sweet home for the next 6 months." The landing was rougher than I expected, the helicopter bouncing slightly before settling onto the marked pad about 50 yards from the main building. As the rotors slowed, the silence of Antarctica began to seep in, broken only by the wind. Joshua helped me unload my bags and the supplies for the station. "I need to do a quick systems check with you before I head back," he said, leading the way to the main entrance. He punched a code into the keypad, and the door slid open with a hiss of pressurized air. The interior was utilitarian but comfortable, a main room with a small kitchen area, several doors leading off to what I assumed were bedrooms and labs. The temperature was pleasantly warm compared to the biting cold outside. "Power systems are running on the generator with solar backup," Joshua explained, pointing to a monitoring panel on the wall. "Communication station is there. You're scheduled for weekly radio check-ins with base. Emergency protocols are in the manual." I nodded, taking it all in. This would be my entire world for half a year. Joshua reached into his flight jacket and pulled out a sealed manila envelope. "Almost forgot. The previous researcher asked me to give this to you directly." He handed it to me. "Terry Lawson, quiet guy, kept to himself mostly." The envelope was sealed with red wax, which seemed oddly formal. My name was written on the front in cramped handwriting. "Any idea what's in it?" I asked. Joshua shook his head. "Not my business. But he was pretty insistent you get it right away." He checked his watch. "I need to head back before the weather turns. The pantry's stocked, water recycling system is working, and you've got enough fuel for the generator to last until extraction. Any questions?" I had about 1,000, but none that seemed urgent enough to delay his departure. "I think I'm good." "Right then." He zipped up his jacket. "Remember, stick to the check-in schedule. If you miss 2 in a row without notice, they'll assume there's an emergency." After a brief handshake, Joshua headed back to the helicopter. I stood in the doorway watching as he completed his pre-flight checks, then lifted off in a swirl of snow. The sound of the rotors faded quickly, leaving only the constant background noise of the wind. I was completely alone. Back inside, I set my bags down and turned the envelope over in my hands. The wax seal cracked easily, and I pulled out a single sheet of paper. At the top, in the same cramped handwriting, were the words, "Whitmore Station Survival Rules." Below were 5 numbered items. 1. Never leave the station alone. Always wait for scheduled supply drops or extraction. 2. During whiteouts, do not look at the horizon for extended periods. 3. Do not open the door for anyone outside of scheduled arrivals, no matter who they claim to be. 4. If you see someone inside the station with no face, continue your activities as normal until they leave. 5. Ignore any music you hear coming from outside the station. I read the list twice, then laughed out loud. The sound strange in the empty station. Was this some kind of initiation prank? The rules were absurd, especially number 4. People with no faces? And what kind of music would I hear in the middle of Antarctica? I set the paper down on the counter and began unpacking my equipment. The main lab was well appointed with everything I'd requested: spectrometers, sample storage, computing equipment. My research on ice core samples would keep me busy for months. After setting up the basic equipment, I decided to check the station logs. Each researcher was required to maintain daily records, and I was curious about my predecessor. The log terminal was in a small office off the main lab. I powered it up and scrolled through the entries. Terry Lawson's logs were meticulous but oddly impersonal. Weather conditions, equipment status, sample collection, nothing that explained the strange list of rules. Until I reached his final entry, dated just 3 days before my arrival. Final samples packaged for transport. Station systems nominal. Dr. Chen, if you're reading this, the rules I left must be followed. I know they sound irrational. They're not. Your life depends on them. That was it. No explanation, no details. Just an ominous warning that contradicted the clinical tone of all his previous entries. I closed the log and walked back to the main room, picking up the list again. The rules seemed like the product of an isolated mind, cracking under the pressure of solitude. Terry had been here for 8 months, 2 months longer than scheduled due to weather delays. That kind of isolation could do strange things to a person's mind. I pinned the list to the bulletin board, more out of respect for Terry's evident concern than any belief in the rules themselves. Then I continued unpacking, setting up my personal quarters in the small bedroom adjacent to the main room. By the time I finished organizing my belongings, the station's clock showed it was past 10 at night, though the Antarctic summer meant it was still light outside. I made a simple meal from the stored provisions and sat at the small dining table, the silence of the station broken only by the hum of equipment and the ever-present wind outside. That night, lying in my narrow bed, I found sleep elusive. The wind had picked up, howling around the corners of the station with an almost vocal quality. The building was solid, but it creaked and groaned under the assault. I stared at the ceiling, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake coming here. 6 months suddenly seemed like an eternity. I thought of Karen, probably already moved in with her new boyfriend in our old house. I thought of my colleagues back at the university, continuing their research with all the resources and companionship I'd left behind. The wind changed pitch, rising to something that sounded almost like a wail before dropping back to a low moan. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, trying to ignore the sound and the growing sense that the station, despite all its modern equipment and sturdy construction, was fragile against the vast, empty wilderness surrounding it. I'd come here to escape, to lose myself in work after my life had fallen apart. Now, listening to the wind's howl, I wondered if there were worse things than facing your failures, like hiding from them in one of the most isolated places on Earth. I settled into a rhythm faster than I expected. Wake up, run diagnostics on the core sampling equipment, check the weather instruments, test the communications array, then work on my actual research. The routine kept me grounded. It gave shape to days that could easily blur together in this endless white landscape. By week 4, I'd mapped out every minute of my day. 6 a.m. alarm, coffee while reviewing yesterday's data, equipment checks from 7 to 9, sample collection until noon, analysis in the afternoon, radio check with base at 6 p.m. sharp, dinner, reading, sleep, repeat. Weather report shows another front moving in tomorrow, I told Destiny during our evening call. The satellite phone connection crackled with static, but her voice came through clear enough. "How bad?" she asked. I checked the barometric readings again. Pressure's dropping fast. Might be a big one. "You've got enough supplies?" "More than enough." I looked around the main room of the station. The shelves were stacked with canned goods and dry provisions. I could survive here for a year if I had to. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," she said with a small laugh. "How are you holding up otherwise?" I thought about how to answer. The truth was, I felt better than I had in months. The clean break from my old life, from the empty apartment, from the constant reminders of Karen, had been exactly what I needed. "I'm good," I said finally. "The work helps." Isolation can be tough on the mind, Maurice. Don't hesitate to call if you need to talk, even outside scheduled check-ins. I appreciate that. After we signed off, I made a simple dinner and ate at the small table, listening to the wind pick up outside. The station creaked and moaned as gusts battered the exterior, but the sounds had become almost comforting. White noise to fill the silence. I glanced at Terry's rules, still pinned to the bulletin board. I hadn't taken them down, but I hadn't experienced anything unusual either. Part of me wondered if Terry had been suffering from the very isolation Destiny had warned about. The human mind could play tricks on itself when starved for stimulation. Still, I followed the rules, just in case. I never went outside alone. I kept the door locked. I didn't stare at the horizon during whiteouts. It cost me nothing to be cautious. That night I slept deeply for the first time since arriving. No tossing and turning, no lying awake listening to the wind, just darkness and rest. The next morning, the storm hit full force. I could barely see 10 feet past the windows, the world beyond reduced to a swirling wall of white. The wind howled at nearly 80 miles per hour, rattling the station's frame. I ran additional checks on the heating system and backup generator before settling in with my samples for the day. The blizzard continued for 3 days. I worked, ate, slept, and tried to ignore the constant assault of wind and ice against the station. By day 37 of my stay, the storm had reached its peak intensity. I was reviewing core sample data at my desk when I heard it, a sound distinct from the howling wind and creaking structure. Knock, knock, knock. 3 sharp raps on the main door. I froze, fingers hovering over my keyboard. Knock, knock, knock. The same pattern, evenly spaced, deliberate. I pulled up the arrival schedule on my computer. The screen confirmed what I already knew. No one was due at Whitmore for another month. Joshua wouldn't attempt a landing in these conditions anyway. Knock, knock, knock. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. The rational part of my brain cycled through explanations. Equipment knocked loose by the wind. Ice buildup falling against the door. My own imagination amplifying normal storm sounds. Knock, knock, knock. But that wasn't random debris. That was a human pattern. Someone, or something, wanted in. Terry's third rule flashed in my mind. Don't open the door for unscheduled arrivals. I took a step toward the entrance, then stopped myself. The knocking continued, steady and patient. What if someone was stranded out there? Another researcher caught in the storm? I pictured a human being freezing to death just yards from safety because I was too paranoid to check. Knock, knock, knock. I moved to the small window beside the door, but the blizzard offered nothing but swirling white. No silhouette, no figure struggling through the snow, just endless, blinding whiteness. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the large room. No answer, just more knocking, maintaining the same steady rhythm. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The knocking never varied. Same force, same timing, same 3-knock pattern. No increased urgency, no signs of weakening. No human could maintain such mechanical consistency while standing in a raging Antarctic blizzard. I returned to my desk, gripping the edges until my knuckles turned white. The third rule: follow the third rule. For 20 minutes the knocking continued. I sat rigid in my chair, staring at my computer screen without seeing it, fighting every instinct to open that door. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the knocking stopped. The silence felt heavier than the storm's roar. I waited, listening intently for any sound beyond the wind, but there was nothing. Whatever had been at the door was gone, or waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back against the wall opposite the door, a heavy wrench in my hand, watching and listening until dawn broke and the storm finally began to subside. When the blizzard cleared the next morning, I suited up in my cold weather gear. I needed to check the exterior sensors anyway, I told myself. It wasn't just to investigate the knocking. I unlocked the door and pushed it open, half expecting to find someone, or something, waiting for me. The air hit me like a physical blow, still bitter cold despite the storm's passing. Fresh snow blanketed everything, pristine and untouched. I stepped outside, my boots sinking several inches into the powder, and looked around. No footprints, no signs anyone or anything had approached the station. The snow lay smooth and unbroken in all directions. I circled the entire station, checking each entrance and window. Nothing. No marks, no tracks, no evidence that anything had been at my door during the night. Back inside, I removed my gear and sat at my desk, pulling out the leather-bound journal I had been keeping separate from my official research logs. I opened to a new page and wrote, Day 37, knocking at main door during blizzard, 20 minutes duration, regular pattern, no visual confirmation, no tracks in morning. Rule number 3 followed. I stared at the words, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I imagined it? Was my mind already breaking down after just over a month of isolation? Or was Terry right about this place? That evening, during my scheduled radio check-in, I considered telling Destiny about the incident. My finger hovered over the transmit button as I weighed my options. If I reported unexplained knocking, she might think I was cracking under the pressure. Worst case, they'd send Joshua to pull me out early, ending my research and possibly my career. Whitmore Station, this is base. How are things today, Maurice? Destiny's voice crackled through the speaker. All systems normal, I replied. Storm passed through. No damage to report. Glad to hear it. Any issues with supplies or equipment? I looked at my journal, still open to the entry about the knocking. No, I said finally. Everything's fine. After signing off, I returned to the bulletin board and studied Terry's rules again. They didn't seem quite so paranoid anymore. I was calibrating the gas chromatography equipment when I noticed someone standing in the far corner of the lab. My hands froze over the keyboard mid-adjustment. The figure wore the standard Antarctic Research Foundation uniform, navy thermal pants and a matching long-sleeve shirt with the foundation patch exactly like mine. But where there should have been a face, there was just smooth skin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a blank expanse where features should be. My stomach dropped. I forced myself to look back at my screen, fingers trembling slightly above the keys. Calibrating the helium flow rate, I said out loud, my voice sounding thin in the quiet lab. Need to adjust the pressure to maintain consistent carrier gas flow. I kept typing, focusing on breathing evenly while my mind raced. Rule 4. Ignore faceless people inside the station until they leave. Terry's rule, the one I dismissed as paranoid delusion 2 weeks ago. The air felt colder near my workstation, though the environmental controls kept the lab at a steady 68 degrees. I continued the calibration sequence, describing each step aloud as if giving a lecture to an invisible student. Now checking detector response against the standard solution, I said, keeping my voice as steady as possible. Baseline stability is essential for accurate quantification. My peripheral vision caught the figure still standing motionless in the corner. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching me with a face that couldn't see. I worked for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, forcing myself through each calibration step while maintaining a running commentary. My hands grew steadier as I focused on the familiar tasks, though sweat had soaked through my shirt under my arms. Final sequence complete. System ready for sample analysis, I announced, finally allowing myself to look up again. The corner was empty. I slumped in my chair, suddenly aware I'd been holding tension in every muscle. The lab looked completely normal, equipment humming, lights bright, everything in its place. No evidence anyone else had been there at all. After sitting motionless for several minutes, I went to my desk and pulled out the leather journal I'd started keeping separate from my official research notes. I opened to a fresh page and wrote, Day 51. First encounter with faceless figure in lab during equipment calibration. Appeared wearing standard station uniform. Maintained position in corner for approximately 10 minutes. Disappeared when not directly observed. Rule number 4 followed. I stared at the words I'd written. 2 weeks ago, I would have questioned my sanity, blamed the isolation or stress. Now, I understood with complete clarity. Terry's rules weren't paranoid ravings. They were survival instructions based on something real. The rules list still hung on the bulletin board in the main room. I walked over and studied it again, reading each line carefully. No longer dismissive, no longer skeptical. Each rule now carried weight, the weight of experience. I spent the next several hours combing through the station's digital archives, searching for any mention of similar phenomena in previous researchers' reports. The official logs contained nothing unusual, just weather data, equipment maintenance records, and research notes. No mention of faceless figures, knocking during storms, or any of the other warnings on Terry's list. Either previous researchers had never encountered these phenomena, or, more likely, they'd kept their experiences out of official records, just as I was doing. I printed out copies of the rules and posted them in every room of the station, one by my bed, one in the bathroom, one in the kitchen area, constant reminders to keep me alive. That evening, I sat at the communications console for my scheduled radio check with Base. The familiar crackle came through as Destiny established the connection. "Whitmore Station, this is McMurdo Base. Radio check over." "McMurdo Base, Whitmore Station receiving. All systems normal," I replied, the practiced response automatic now. "How are things going, Maurice?" Destiny asked, her voice warm with the familiar slight British accent that always came through clearly despite the distance. "Any issues to report?" My fingers tightened around the microphone. I could tell her. I could describe the faceless figure, the knocking during the blizzard. I could ask if Terry had reported similar experiences, but I knew what would happen. Destiny would document my report. There would be concerns about my psychological state. Isolation-induced hallucinations were well documented in Antarctic research literature. They'd send Joshua with the helicopter for an early evacuation, citing concerns for my well-being. My research would end prematurely. My career would effectively be over. Who would hire a researcher who couldn't handle isolation, who hallucinated during fieldwork? "No issues," I said finally. "Equipment functioning within parameters. Weather stable for the season." "That's good to hear," she replied. "We've got some weather systems developing that might head your way next week. Nothing severe, but keep an eye on barometric readings." "Will do," I said. "Anything else I should know?" "All quiet on our end. Your replacement, Eliana, has completed her preliminary training. She's scheduled to arrive on your extraction date about 8 weeks from now. 8 more weeks. 8 more weeks of faceless visitors and knocking in the night." "Understood," I said. "I'll prepare transition documentation for her arrival." We finished the check-in with the usual procedural confirmations. After signing off, I sat in silence, staring at the radio equipment. The decision to withhold information felt both necessary and dangerous. Necessary for my career, dangerous for my safety. I returned to the main room and stood before the rules list again. No longer just 5 lines on paper, but a lifeline, concrete instructions for surviving whatever this place was, whatever watched me from corners with no face, whatever knocked at doors during blizzards. I traced my finger along Rule 4, ignore faceless people inside the station until they leave. I'd followed it today, and I was still alive. I would follow all of them for the next 8 weeks. I had to. I stared at the data scrolling across my monitor. The ice core samples from Site B17 showed a distinct carbon layer that didn't match the timeline I'd established. Somewhere around 12,000 years ago, something had happened that didn't fit the model. I rubbed my eyes and checked the time on my watch, just past 11 at night. I'd been at this for hours. That's when I heard it. A soft, delicate melody drifted through the station walls. The notes were clear and crystalline, like a music box playing a lullaby I almost recognized. I froze, fingers hovering over my keyboard. It wasn't possible. Not here, 90 miles from the nearest human beings, in the middle of a howling Antarctic night. I pushed back from my desk and stood, head tilted. The melody continued, sweet and inviting. It seemed to come from outside the east wall, near the emergency exit. The sound was impossibly clear, despite the wind that had been battering the station all day. My feet moved before I realized it. 3 steps toward the hallway that led to the exit. The tune was beautiful, childlike and innocent. What could possibly be playing music out there? I needed to know. I took another step. Then I remembered Terry's 5th rule: ignore outside music. I gripped the back of my desk chair hard enough that my knuckles went white. The plastic creaked under my fingers. "It's not real," I said aloud, my voice sounding flat and wrong against the haunting melody. "It's not real, and I'm not going out there." I sat back down, but the music continued. It rose and fell in gentle waves, sometimes so faint I could barely hear it, then swelling until it filled the entire station. I tried to focus on my data, on the anomalous carbon layer, on anything but the sweet, compelling music that seemed to call directly to me. After 20 minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I got up and went to the kitchen, found my earbuds, and shoved them in. I turned on a podcast, some guys talking about basketball, and cranked the volume until it hurt. The lullaby played underneath it all. I pulled the earbuds out and threw them across the room. "Stop it," I hissed at the empty air. The music continued, unaffected by my outburst. I went back to my desk and tried to work. When that failed, I tried reading. Then I tried pacing. Nothing helped. The melody wormed its way into my brain, making it impossible to think about anything else. It was like the music knew me somehow, knew exactly what would appeal to me, what would make me want to open that door and step outside to find its source. Hours passed. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, hands pressed against my ears, focusing on my breathing the way I'd learned in that meditation app Karen had made me try when things started falling apart between us. In, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3, 4. Out, 2, 3, 4. The music faded sometimes, becoming just a whisper at the edge of hearing. Then it would swell again, filling every corner of the station, impossible to ignore. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke with a start, my neck stiff from leaning against the wall. Pale gray light filtered through the small windows. Dawn. The music was gone. I stood up slowly, my body aching from the hours on the hard floor. The station was silent except for the familiar hum of equipment and the muted howl of the wind. I made coffee and tried to convince myself it had been a dream or a hallucination brought on by isolation and fatigue. But I knew better. I looked at the rules pinned to the bulletin board, focusing on number 5. Terry had known. He'd experienced this too. I showered, changed clothes, and tried to get back to work. The carbon layer anomaly was still there, still unexplained. Science made sense. Data made sense. I clung to that. 3 days later, I was in the lab running samples through the mass spectrometer when I felt a presence behind me. I turned, and there it was, a figure wearing the standard Antarctic Research Foundation uniform, complete with the patch on the sleeve. But where its face should have been was just nothing. Smooth, featureless skin. My heart slammed against my ribs, but I remembered Rule 4. Ignore faceless people inside the station until they leave. I turned back to the spectrometer, my hands shaking so badly I had to grip the edge of the counter. Sample 47B shows elevated methane levels, I said aloud, my voice quavering, noting time stamp and depth markers. The faceless figure stood silently in the corner of the lab. I could feel its attention on me like a physical weight. I continued working, narrating what I was doing in a voice that gradually steadied, moving to sample 48A, preparing slide, adjusting calibration. After what felt like hours but was probably only 15 minutes, I risked a glance at the corner. Empty. The figure was gone. I sank onto a stool, my legs suddenly too weak to hold me up. I'd known the rules were important, but now I understood they were the only thing keeping me alive. The faceless visitor returned a week later while I was making dinner. I'd just put a frozen meal in the microwave when I felt that same weight of attention. I turned and saw it standing by the refrigerator, wearing the same uniform, its blank face turned toward me. Dinner will be ready in 3 minutes, I said, focusing on keeping my voice steady. I need to check my email while it cooks. I walked past the figure, careful not to touch it, and went to my laptop on the dining table. I opened my email and started typing a message to Sophia about my latest findings, describing what I was writing aloud as if giving a presentation to a colleague. When I looked up again, the kitchen was empty. The third time was the worst. I woke in the middle of the night to the sensation of being watched. I opened my eyes, and it was there, standing beside my bed, looking down at me with its featureless face. I almost screamed. My throat closed up, and for several seconds, I couldn't breathe at all. Then training kicked in, not anything the Foundation had taught me, but the rules, Terry's rules. I need to check the temperature readings, I said, my voice a dry rasp. The sensor in Lab 2 has been fluctuating. I got out of bed on the side away from the figure and walked to my desk where I kept a tablet with the station's monitoring systems. My hands were ice cold as I tapped the screen and pulled up the temperature logs. Lab 2 holding steady at 68 degrees, I said. Main room at 66, all within normal parameters. When I turned around, my bedroom was empty again. After that, I started keeping a log. Not in the official station records. I wasn't about to tell Destiny or anyone else at McMurdo what was happening here, but in a separate notebook I kept hidden under my mattress. I recorded each incident with clinical precision. Day 62. Music outside East Wall. Duration, approximately 4 hours. Began 23:15, ended near dawn. Description, music box lullaby, variable volume. Response, stayed inside per rule number 5. Day 70. Faceless figure in laboratory. Duration, 15 minutes. Wearing standard ARF uniform. Response, continued work. Verbal narration of actions. Rule number 4 followed. Day 78. Faceless figure in kitchen. Duration, 8 minutes. Standard uniform. Response, continued normal activities with verbal narration. Rule number 4 followed. Day 85. Faceless figure in bedroom, standing beside bed. Duration, 12 minutes. Standard uniform. Response, got up, checked monitoring systems with verbal narration. Rule number 4 followed. As the weeks passed, I added more entries. The music returned twice more, always at night, always lasting until dawn. The faceless figure appeared with increasing frequency. Sometimes in the lab, sometimes in the main room, once in the bathroom while I was brushing my teeth. I began to notice patterns. The music only came during storms. The faceless visitor never appeared on days when I'd had radio contact with McMurdo. It never tried to touch me or communicate, just watched. And it always disappeared when I wasn't looking directly at it. I started a new page in my notebook titled Theories, but it remained blank. I had no explanation for what was happening at Whitmore Station. All I knew was that Terry's rules worked, and following them kept me alive. In my official reports to McMurdo, everything was normal. In my private log, I documented a reality that no one would believe, a reality that would get me pulled from the station and probably committed if I ever shared it. As I wrote the latest entry in my log, Day 92, faceless figure in main room, 18 minutes, standard uniform, I realized something that made my blood run cold. I was getting used to this. The terror was still there, but it was becoming routine, almost expected. I wondered if that was how Terry had felt, or if he'd found some explanation that made sense of it all. I closed the notebook and slid it back under my mattress. 3 more months until extraction. 3 more months of music and faceless visitors and pretending everything was fine during radio checks. I went back to the main room and looked at Terry's rules on the bulletin board. They had saved me so far. I had to trust they would keep saving me until I could leave this place behind. I sat at the communications console for my scheduled check-in, tapping the desk as I waited for the connection to establish. The radio crackled with static before Destiny's voice came through, clear despite the miles between us. Whitmore Station, this is McMurdo Base. Do you copy? McMurdo Base, this is Whitmore. I copy, I said, leaning toward the microphone. Weekly check-in, as scheduled. Good to hear your voice, Maurice. How are things at the station this week? I opened my mouth to deliver my usual response. All systems normal, research progressing, but hesitated. The knocking had returned last night. 3 distinct raps, followed by silence, then 3 more. It continued for nearly an hour before stopping. Maurice? Are you there? Yeah, sorry, just checking some readings, I lied, glancing at the bulletin board where Terry's rules hung. Rule 3 stared back at me. Don't open door for unscheduled arrivals. Everything's fine, just the usual. After finishing the call with a promise to check in next week, I walked to the kitchen and made a cup of instant coffee. The hot liquid warmed my hands as I looked out the small window. Antarctica stretched endlessly white in all directions, beautiful and deadly. The wind picked up, whistling around the station's exterior, a prelude to another storm. I was right. By evening, the weather station registered wind speeds of 60 miles per hour, with visibility dropping to near zero. I double-checked all systems, ensuring the backup generator was ready if needed, then settled at my desk to review the day's ice core data. The first knock came at 11:37. 3 sharp raps, evenly spaced, exactly like before. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I waited, hoping it wouldn't continue. 3 more knocks, identical in rhythm and force. I pushed back from my desk and stood listening. The wind howled outside, but the knocking cut through it with impossible clarity. Whatever was out there wanted me to know it was there. 3 more knocks. I walked to the main room and stared at the door. The small reinforced window showed nothing but swirling white. No silhouette, no movement beyond the snow. The knocking continued. 3 raps. Pause. 3 raps. Pause. 3 raps. Like a machine programmed for perfect consistency. Each knock exactly as loud as the one before. Each pause exactly the same duration. An hour passed, then 2. I sat in the chair facing the door, hands gripping the armrests. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the room's chill. My throat felt dry, but I couldn't make myself move to get water. The knocking never varied, never grew more insistent or frustrated, just the same mechanical pattern, over and over. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks. Pause. Human knocking would show signs of impatience. It would grow louder, more erratic. A person would call out, try the handle, eventually give up. This wasn't human. 3 hours into the relentless knocking, I found myself whispering the words of Rule 3 like a mantra. Don't open door for unscheduled arrivals. Don't open door for unscheduled arrivals. My shirt clung to my back with sweat. I couldn't feel my fingers anymore. I'd been gripping the chair so tightly. And still, the knocking continued with that perfect, inhuman rhythm. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence felt more terrifying than the knocking. I remained frozen in the chair, listening to the storm and my own ragged breathing. Minutes stretched into an hour, nothing. Eventually, my muscles screamed for movement. I stood on shaky legs and made my way to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face. In the mirror, a haggard stranger stared back at me, pale, wide-eyed, hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. The knocking didn't return, but the memory of its mechanical persistence kept me alert, jumping at every creak and groan of the station. In my journal, I wrote, Day 112, knocking incident. 3-hour duration, perfect mechanical rhythm, no visual confirmation, no human variation in pattern or intensity. The weather cleared 2 weeks later, giving me my first chance to check the exterior sensors and equipment. I suited up in my cold weather gear, thermal layers, heavy parka, insulated boots, gloves, and face protection. The temperature outside read -45 degrees with minimal wind, practically balmy by Antarctic standards. I stepped outside, the snow crunching beneath my boots. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the pristine white landscape. I methodically checked each exterior sensor, brushing away accumulated snow and ice, verifying connections. As I rounded the corner to check the eastern wall, something caught my eye. Dark marks marred the metal siding near the main entrance. I approached slowly, my breath fogging in front of me. What I saw made my blood run cold despite my layers of insulation. Deep gouges cut into the metal wall. Not scratches, not weather damage. Gouges. 4 parallel lines, each about 8 inches long and nearly half an inch deep. The metal was peeled back at the edges, like something with immense strength had raked claws across the surface. I pulled off my glove and touched the marks with a trembling finger. The edges were sharp, recent. This wasn't old damage I'd somehow missed during my initial inspection of the station. Something had done this since I arrived. I pulled out the digital camera I'd brought to document any equipment issues and took several photos of the gouges. Then I retrieved a small measuring tape from my pack and carefully recorded the dimensions. 8 inches long, spaced approximately 2 inches apart, half an inch deep into solid metal. My mind raced through possibilities. No known Antarctic wildlife could make marks like these. Penguins had no claws. Seals couldn't reach this height, and we were hundreds of miles from the ocean anyway. I checked the rest of the station's exterior, finding 3 more sets of similar gouges, all near access points. The main door, the emergency exit, the supply entrance, all marked with the same 4-line pattern of deep cuts. Something with claws had been trying to get inside. Back in the station, I pulled off my cold weather gear with shaking hands and immediately went to my computer. I downloaded the photos and began comparing the marks to every known Antarctic animal. Nothing matched, not even close. I created a new folder on my personal hard drive labeled Exterior Damage and saved the photos and measurements. Then I wrote in my journal, Day 127, discovered claw marks on station exterior near all entry points. 4 parallel gouges, 8 long, 2 apart, 0.5 deep. No known wildlife match. Recent damage. That night, I dragged a heavy metal storage cabinet in front of the main door. I knew it wouldn't stop whatever had made those marks if it really wanted to get in, but it made me feel better. I did the same with the emergency exit, blocking it with equipment cases and sample containers. The weekly radio check with McMurdo came too soon. I sat at the console staring at the microphone, trying to compose myself. When Destiny's voice came through, I flinched. Whitmore Station, this is McMurdo Base. Weekly check-in. Do you copy? I took a deep breath. McMurdo, this is Whitmore. I copy. Maurice, you sound different. Everything okay? I closed my eyes. What could I say? I found claw marks that suggest something inhuman is trying to get into the station. I've been hearing knocking with mechanical precision during blizzards. There's a faceless person who appears inside the station. Just tired, I said instead. Been working long hours on the samples. Your voice sounds strained. Are you feeling all right physically? Any symptoms we should know about? No symptoms. I paused, trying to find an explanation she would accept. Just the isolation, I think. Starting to feel the effects. That's completely normal, Maurice. Her tone softened with understanding. 4 months is a long time to be alone. You're past the halfway point now. Many researchers report psychological effects around this time. Changes in sleep patterns, mood fluctuations, even mild hallucinations in some cases. Hallucinations? If only it were that simple. Yeah, that must be it, I agreed, seizing the excuse. Sleep hasn't been great lately. Try to maintain your routine, regular meals, exercise, consistent sleep schedule when possible. The structure helps counter the effects of isolation. And remember, I'm available for unscheduled calls if you need to talk. Thanks, Destiny. I appreciate that. Only 2 more months until extraction. You're doing well, Maurice. Just hang in there. If she only knew what hanging in there actually meant. After the call ended, I returned to my desk and pulled out the rules list again. I'd been following them religiously, never going outside alone, though that rule seemed irrelevant since I was the only person here, not looking at the horizon during whiteouts, not opening the door for unscheduled arrivals, ignoring the faceless visitor, ignoring the music. The rules had kept me alive so far, but they didn't explain what was happening or why. They didn't tell me what had left those claw marks or what knocked with such mechanical precision. I looked at the photos of the gouges again. Whatever had made them was large, powerful, and determined. The barricades I'd created were laughable in comparison to the strength needed to tear into metal like that. 2 more months until extraction. 2 more months of knocking, faceless visitors, and music. 2 more months wondering if the next time whatever was out there might find its way in. I closed the folder of photos and shut down my computer. In the quiet of the station, the wind picked up again outside, whistling around the corners with an almost vocal quality. I tried not to hear words in it, tried not to imagine it calling my name. Human resources would call it the psychological effects of prolonged isolation. Destiny would call it normal. Terry Lawson had called it something else entirely when he wrote those rules. Terry had called it survival. The music changed one night, catching me off guard. Not the tinkling melody of a music box anymore, but a full orchestra, violins and cellos rising and falling with the precision of a professional symphony. I sat at my desk, pen frozen mid-sentence in my research log. The sound came through the eastern wall, near the emergency exit I'd barricaded weeks ago. I clenched my jaw and tried to focus on my work. The carbon anomaly in sample B17 needed proper documentation, but the music made it hard to think straight. It swelled and receded like ocean waves, each crescendo more beautiful than the last. A woman's voice joined in, singing in a language I couldn't place, something with rolling syllables and strange inflections. Ignore it, I whispered to myself. Rule number 5, ignore outside music. But this wasn't like the simple music box tune. This was complex, layered, performed by what sounded like dozens of musicians and at least one vocalist. The composition itself was unlike anything I'd heard before, haunting minor chords resolving into unexpected harmonies that made my chest ache with their beauty. I pushed back from my desk and walked to the kitchen, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the sound. My hand shook as I filled the electric kettle. The music followed me, somehow maintaining the same volume regardless of where I stood in the station. The kettle clicked off. I poured hot water over a tea bag and sat at the small table, gripping the mug until my knuckles turned white. Helium flow rate adjustments require calibration to 0.05 psi, I said aloud, reciting equipment specifications from memory. Mass spectrometer sensitivity must be maintained at minimum threshold of... The singing grew louder, drowning out my words. More voices joined the first. A chorus now, their harmonies so perfect they seemed impossible. I recognized the manipulation for what it was. The music box melody had been a test, and now whatever was out there had escalated using something more sophisticated. I abandoned my tea and moved to the center of the main room, as far from any exterior walls as possible. The ice core from site B17 shows carbon deposits at 12,000 years, inconsistent with established timeline data from adjacent sites, I said louder this time. Possible contamination requires secondary verification through... The music swelled again. I grabbed my tablet and pulled up a spreadsheet of temperature readings from the past month. I began calculating standard deviations aloud, speaking the numbers and formulas like a shield against the sound. Mean temperature minus 27.8, variance 3.6, standard deviation 1.897. For hours, I fought the urge to look out the windows, to peer into the darkness for the source of that impossible orchestra. I moved from calculations to equipment inventories to reciting passages from research papers I'd memorized. Anything to fill my mind with something other than curiosity about the music. When dawn broke, the symphony faded gradually until only silence remained. I sat on the floor, back against the wall, throat raw from hours of continuous talking. My head pounded from the effort and lack of sleep. In my journal, I wrote, Day 133, orchestral music with vocal accompaniment. Duration, approximately 6 hours. More complex than previous incidents, countered with verbal recitation of technical data. I underlined more complex twice. 3 nights later, it happened again. This time, the music included what sounded like tribal drums and flutes alongside the orchestra, creating rhythms that seemed to match my heartbeat. I responded by writing a detailed report on anomalous ice formations, speaking each word aloud as I typed. The pattern continued for weeks. Each night brought new musical variations, sometimes classical, sometimes what sounded like ancient ceremonial music, sometimes modern compositions with electronic elements. I developed a rotation of mental exercises, equipment specifications on Mondays, mathematical calculations on Tuesdays, detailed research summaries on Wednesdays, and so on. My sleep suffered. Even when the music wasn't playing, I lay awake anticipating it, or replaying melodies in my head that I couldn't seem to forget. I started taking short naps during daylight hours when the phenomena seemed less active. On day 145, I was running a sample through the mass spectrometer when I felt the familiar change in air pressure that preceded the appearance of the faceless figure. I kept my eyes on the equipment, continuing my work as I'd done before. Sample loading complete, I said aloud. Beginning analysis sequence. From the corner of my eye, I saw it standing by the door, the same featureless person in the Antarctic Research Foundation uniform. But something was different this time. It held something in its hands. I forced myself to look directly at the mass spectrometer display, reading off the numbers as they appeared. Methane levels at 3 parts per million, carbon dioxide at... The figure moved closer, something I'd never seen it do before. My hands trembled on the keyboard, but I kept typing, kept talking. Adjusting sensitivity parameters to account for sample degradation. It now stood just 6 feet away, close enough that I could see what it held in its outstretched hands. My face, my own face, like a mask removed from my head, eyes staring blankly, mouth slightly open. My stomach lurched. I bent over and vomited on the floor, my breakfast coming up in a burning rush. The smell of acid filled my nose as I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand. Still, I didn't run, didn't scream. I straightened up, stepped away from the puddle, and reached for my research notes on the nearby counter. Ice core sample B22 shows evidence of atmospheric particulates consistent with volcanic activity approximately 8,000 years before present, I read, voice shaking but determined. Sulfur content exceeds baseline by factor of 3.2. The figure stood motionless, still holding my face in its hands like an offering. I kept reading, moving on to the next page when I finished the first. Comparative analysis with samples from Site C4 indicates regional distribution of ash layer, suggesting eruption of sufficient magnitude to impact climate patterns across. I continued for what felt like hours but was likely less than one, based on the clock on the wall. The faceless entity remained perfectly still, holding my face the entire time. Finally, after 57 minutes by the clock, it vanished between one blink and the next, taking the face with it. I collapsed into the chair, shaking uncontrollably. After cleaning up the vomit with paper towels and disinfectant, I wrote in my journal, Day 145. Faceless figure appeared with new tactic, holding what appeared to be my own face. Duration, 57 minutes. Countered with continuous reading of research notes despite physical illness. Entity, more aggressive than previous encounters. The incidents grew more frequent after that. The faceless figure appeared every 3 days instead of weekly, standing closer each time, sometimes holding my face, sometimes empty-handed. The music played almost nightly now, growing more complex and beautiful, sometimes including what sounded like my name woven into the melodies. One night, both happened simultaneously. The music played outside while the faceless figure stood in my bedroom doorway. I sat on the edge of my bed reciting the periodic table, then all the bones in the human body, then every Antarctic research station I could name. Sleep became my enemy. I couldn't risk more than 2 hours at a time, fearing what might happen during longer periods of unconsciousness. I set alarms on my phone, my watch, and the station clock, staggering them to ensure I'd wake up. After a particularly bad night where the faceless figure stood at the foot of my bed for 3 hours, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. Dark circles hung under my bloodshot eyes. My cheeks had hollowed, and my skin had taken on a grayish tone. I'd lost at least 15 pounds since arriving at Whitmore. But my mind felt sharper in some ways. I could recite pages of data from memory now, could perform complex calculations without a calculator, could focus my thoughts with laser precision when needed. During my weekly call with Destiny, she commented on my appearance. "Maurice, you look terrible. Are you sleeping at all?" "Enough," I lied. "The research is demanding. Your extraction is in 5 weeks. Do you need us to send someone sooner?" I thought about it for a moment. 5 more weeks of this hell. 5 more weeks of music and faceless visitors and psychological warfare. "No," I said finally. "I'll finish my contract." After ending the call, I sat at my desk and opened my journal to a new page. At the top, I wrote, "Understanding the rules." Below, I began to analyze what I'd learned. 1. Never leave the station alone. They want me outside where I'm vulnerable. 2. Don't look at the horizon during whiteouts. Something out there wants me to see it. 3. Don't open door for unscheduled arrivals. They mimic human behavior to gain entry. 4. Ignore faceless people inside station. They test my psychological breaking point. 5. Ignore outside music. They use beauty to lure me out. I stared at what I'd written. For the first time, I truly understood. This wasn't just about random supernatural phenomena. This was systematic psychological manipulation. Each rule protected against a specific tactic designed to exploit basic human instincts, curiosity, social connection, the desire to help others, and the longing for beauty and companionship. Whatever existed here, whether paranormal entities, hallucinations brought on by isolation, or something beyond my understanding, they were intelligent, they learned, they adapted their strategies, and they were testing my resolve with increasing sophistication. I closed the journal and leaned back in my chair, listening to the wind howl outside. In 5 weeks, Eliana Arnold would arrive to take my place. I needed to survive until then. More importantly, I needed to make sure she understood what she was facing. The rules weren't just guidelines. They were a defense system, developed through the suffering of researchers before me. Terry Lawson had passed them to me, and I would pass them to Eliana, along with everything I'd learned about resisting the manipulation. I set my alarm for 2 hours later and lay down on my bunk, knowing the music would likely start soon. My body ached with exhaustion, but my mind remained clear and focused. I'd come to understand that following the rules wasn't merely about survival, it was about maintaining humanity in the face of forces that understood exactly how to strip it away. I'd never experienced all 3 at once before. That's what made Night 152 different. The faceless figure stood in the corner of the lab, wearing the standard Antarctic Research Foundation uniform, completely still with that blank space where a face should be. At the same time, the knocking started at the main door. 3 perfect raps, pause, 3 more, with mechanical precision that no human hand could maintain. And through the eastern wall, the music began to play. violins and cellos weaving into what sounded like a lullaby, but with words in a language I couldn't place. I sat at my desk, forcing my eyes back to the monitor where ice core data scrolled past. My hands shook as I typed notes about the carbon dating anomalies in sample B23. The keys clattered under my trembling fingers. "Sample shows consistent markers with previous findings," I said out loud, my voice cracking. Continuing analysis of particulate matter in Section 4. The knocking maintained its perfect rhythm. The music swelled with new instruments joining. Flutes and what might have been a harp. The faceless figure took a step closer. I gripped the edge of the desk until my knuckles went white. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to hide, to answer the door, to listen to the music. Instead, I kept typing, kept narrating my work in a voice that sounded nothing like my own. "Calibrating for margin of error in carbon dating," I said, louder now, checking reference samples for contamination. The figure took another step. Now it stood just 8 feet away, its blank face turned toward me. The knocking grew louder, though the rhythm never changed. The music added drums that matched my heartbeat. My mind felt like it was splitting apart. I'd handled each phenomenon separately before, but together they created a kind of pressure that made my ears pop and my vision blur at the edges. "Continuing work on ice core timeline," I said, nearly shouting now. "Sample B23 shows volcanic ash consistent with eruption period from 12,000 years ago." Hours passed this way. I recited every piece of scientific data I could remember. I listed the elements in the periodic table. I worked through complex equations. I narrated every keystroke as I typed. Sweat soaked through my thermal shirt, despite the cold. My throat went raw. The figure never moved from its new position. The knocking never varied its pattern. The music kept playing, sometimes seeming to whisper my name between notes. When the first hint of dawn lightened the window, everything stopped at once. The figure vanished between one blink and the next. The knocking cut off mid-rap. The music died so suddenly that the silence felt physical, like pressure against my eardrums. I sat frozen for several minutes, afraid to move. The sudden absence of all three phenomena left me disoriented, as if I'd been leaning against a door that suddenly opened. Finally, I stood on shaking legs and walked to the small bathroom. The face in the mirror looked like it belonged to someone else. Hollow cheeks, dark circles under bloodshot eyes, skin with a grayish tinge. I'd lost more weight. My thermal shirt hung loose where it had once fit snugly. I splashed cold water on my face and braced my hands against the sink. "They're testing me," I whispered to my reflection. "They're working together now." Back at my desk, I pulled out my leather journal and made a new entry. Day 152, first convergence of all three phenomena. Faceless figure in lab corner, knocking at main door, music through east wall. Duration, approximately 6 hours, 22:15:04:30. All ceased simultaneously at dawn. I closed the journal and slid it under my mattress. 6 weeks remained until extraction. 6 more weeks of this, or worse. As I lay on my bunk staring at the ceiling, I thought about Terry Lawson's rules. They had kept me alive so far. I'd followed them religiously, and while the phenomena had escalated, I was still here, still sane enough to record what was happening. The rules weren't just paranoid ramblings. They were a survival guide. Each rule protected against a specific human weakness. Rule 1, never leave the station alone, prevented isolation in the vast Antarctic emptiness, where anything could happen without witnesses. Rule 2, don't look at the horizon during whiteouts, stopped whatever visual tricks or hallucinations the conditions might cause. Rule 3, don't open doors for unscheduled arrivals, kept out whatever made those perfect knocks and left those claw marks. Rule 4, ignore faceless people until they leave, prevented interaction with entities that might harm or replace me. Rule 5, ignore outside music, blocked whatever lured people with beautiful sounds. Each phenomenon exploited basic human instincts: curiosity, social connection, the desire to help others, and the longing for beauty and companionship. They were targeting what made us human. I got up and walked to the bulletin board where Terry's rules hung. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges. I touched it gently, grateful for this stranger's warning. My replacement, Eliana Arnold, would arrive in 6 weeks. The same helicopter that came to extract me would drop her off. She would face these things alone, just as I had, unless I prepared her better than Terry had prepared me. I went to my desk and took out a fresh notebook. On the first page I wrote, "Whitmore Station Survival Rules, updated," in block letters. Below I copied Terry's 5 rules, then began adding detailed notes about each phenomenon. Rule number 3, don't open door for unscheduled arrivals. Notes: knocking occurs during storms or at night. Pattern is always 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. Rhythm never varies in speed, force, or timing, in human precision. Duration ranges from 20 minutes to 3+ hours. Claw marks found near all entrances. 4 parallel lines, 8 inches long, 2 inches apart, 1 to 2 inch deep. I continued through each rule, adding everything I'd learned: when phenomena occurred, how long they lasted, what seemed to trigger them, and most importantly, what strategies worked against them. I noted that speaking aloud about work helped with the faceless figure, that changing locations didn't affect the music's volume, that the knocking seemed to test patience rather than fear. For the next week, I refined this document between research tasks. I included photos of the claw marks and detailed my theory about the phenomena targeting human instincts. During my weekly radio check with Destiny, I stuck to practical handover information. "I've organized all research files by date and sample location," I told her. "The equipment maintenance logs are up to date, and I've inventoried all supplies." "That's great, Maurice," Destiny said, her voice crackling slightly over the connection. "Eliana has completed her training and is looking forward to continuing your work. She'll arrive on the same helicopter coming for your extraction." I hesitated, wondering how much I should say over the radio. "I've prepared some station-specific information for her." "Excellent. Any special instructions about the equipment?" "Nothing that can't wait until she's here," I said carefully. "Some things are better explained in person." "Of course. Just 4 more weeks, Maurice. You've done great work there." After signing off, I returned to my updated rules document. Reading them wouldn't be enough. Terry had left me the rules, and I'd still initially dismissed them as paranoia or pranks. Eliana might do the same. I needed to explain them to her personally. I needed her to see my face when I told her these things were real. I needed to make her understand that her life depended on following these rules, just as mine had. I added a final note at the bottom of the document. "These rules have saved my life repeatedly. They are not suggestions. They are not paranoid delusions. They are your survival manual for Whitmore Station." I folded the papers and placed them in a manila envelope similar to the one Terry had left me. But unlike Terry, I wouldn't just leave this for Eliana to find. I would hand it to her myself and make sure she understood, before the helicopter left, before I left her alone with whatever haunted this place. I sealed the envelope and wrote her name on it. 4 more weeks. 4 more weeks of facing these things alone, of pretending everything was normal during radio checks, of preparing my replacement for horrors she couldn't possibly imagine. 4 more weeks until I could leave this frozen hell behind, and 4 more weeks to make sure Eliana would survive it. I spent my final day at the station packing up my belongings. My movements felt mechanical, practiced, like I was following a checklist in my head rather than preparing to leave a place that had nearly driven me insane. Thermal shirts folded into neat squares, notebooks stacked by date, equipment cleaned and stored in proper sequence. Each item had its place, and I worked methodically to restore order before departure. The station felt different today, quieter. as if whatever haunted this place recognized my imminent departure and had pulled back to observe from a distance. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see the faceless figure standing in a doorway or hear the mechanical knocking start up again. But for the first time in months, I experienced nothing but ordinary silence. I zipped up my duffel bag and set it by the door. The rules list sat on my desk, freshly copied and sealed in an envelope with Eliana's name written across the front. I picked it up, feeling its weight, not physical, but the weight of responsibility. My replacement would arrive in a few hours, and her survival depended on what I could teach her in the brief window before the helicopter left. Extraction day, I said aloud to the empty room. 182 days completed. I walked through each room of the station, checking systems one final time. The generator hummed at optimal capacity. Backup power systems showed green across the board. The lab equipment sat clean and calibrated, ready for Eliana to begin her research. I'd left everything in better condition than I'd found it. Everything except perhaps myself. The radio crackled to life at precisely 9 a.m. Whitmore Station, this is Joshua Hansen. Do you copy? Estimated arrival in 40 minutes. Weather conditions optimal. Over. I moved to the communications console and pressed the transmit button. Copy that, Joshua. All clear for landing. I'm packed and ready. Over. Roger that. Bringing your replacement, Dr. Arnold. Any last-minute requests? Over. I paused, finger hovering over the button. I wanted to say something about the rules, about the things I'd seen, about the claw marks still visible on the exterior walls. Instead, I pressed down and said, Negative. Just looking forward to seeing another human face. Over. Copy that. See you soon. Out. For the next half hour, I sat at my desk, reading through my private journal one more time. The entries chronicled my descent from skepticism to terror to a strange kind of acceptance. I'd documented each encounter with clinical precision. Dates, times, durations, behaviors. Part of me wanted to take this journal with me as proof of what I'd experienced, but I knew Eliana would need it more than any researcher back at headquarters. I added it to the envelope with the rules. At 10 minutes to 10, I put on my cold weather gear, thermal layers, heavy parka, insulated pants, boots rated for -60 degrees, gloves, and face protection. I stood by the window, scanning the horizon, waiting. I stood by the window, scanning the horizon, waiting for the first glimpse of the helicopter. The sky was clear today, a pale, washed-out blue that seemed to stretch forever over the white landscape. After months of whiteouts and storms, it felt almost like the weather was offering a small kindness for my departure. A tiny black speck appeared in the distance, growing larger as it approached. Joshua's helicopter. My heart rate picked up and I realized I was gripping the envelope so tightly I'd crumpled one corner. I smoothed it out carefully and tucked it inside my jacket. Relief washed over me as the helicopter grew from a speck to a recognizable shape, but close behind that relief came a wave of concern. I was leaving. Eliana was staying. She would face these things alone, just as I had, and all I could offer her was a list of rules and my scattered observations. Would it be enough? I stepped outside as the helicopter approached, the cold air biting at the small exposed portion of my face. The wind from the rotors whipped up snow and swirling clouds as Joshua brought the aircraft down with practiced precision, landing in almost the exact spot where he'd dropped me off 6 months ago. The engines remained running as the side door slid open. A woman in a bright red parka jumped down, ducking under the rotors. Eliana Arnold. She was shorter than I'd expected, with auburn hair peeking out from under her hat. She approached with confident strides, extending a gloved hand as she reached me. Dr. Santos, I'm Eliana Arnold. I shook her hand firmly. Maurice, good to meet you in person. Joshua emerged from the pilot's side, walking around to begin unloading Eliana's equipment and supplies. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I pulled the envelope from inside my jacket and pressed it into her hands. "This is important," I said, my voice urgent, even as I kept it low enough that Joshua couldn't hear over the helicopter's idle. "More important than anything else I could tell you about this station." She looked down at the envelope, then back at me with confusion. "What is it? Some kind of research notes?" "Rules," I said, "for surviving here. There are things at this station that aren't in any of the briefing materials." Her expression shifted, eyebrows drawing together. "What kind of things?" Joshua called out from behind the helicopter. "Got the first crate ready to move inside. Dr. Arnold, where do you want your equipment cases?" "Main lab, please," she called back, then turned to me again, her voice lower. "What are you talking about? What things?" I glanced at Joshua to make sure he was occupied, then spoke quickly. "You'll see figures without faces. They'll stand and watch you. There's knocking at the doors during storms. Perfect mechanical knocking. Music outside that sounds beautiful but gets inside your head. And something outside that leaves claw marks on the walls." Her expression transformed from skepticism to concern as I spoke, her eyes widening slightly. "Is this some kind of initiation joke?" she asked, but her voice lacked conviction. She could see I wasn't joking. "I thought the same thing when I got here. The previous researcher left me these rules and I thought he'd lost his mind from isolation. I was wrong." I tapped the envelope in her hands. "Never leave the station alone. Don't look at the horizon during whiteouts. Don't open the door for unscheduled arrivals. Ignore the faceless people inside until they leave. Ignore the music outside." Joshua approached with another case. "Where's this one go?" Eliana composed herself quickly. "That one goes in my quarters, thanks." As Joshua headed toward the station entrance, I continued. "I've added notes about what I've seen, patterns I've noticed. It's all in there. Read it today. Memorize the rules." She nodded slowly, tucking the envelope into her own jacket. "You really believe this?" "I didn't at first, now I do." I looked toward the station. "Whatever's here, it tests you, it learns, it tries to find ways around the rules. Why didn't you report any of this? Would you have believed me? Would anyone?" I shook my head. "They would have pulled me out for psychological evaluation. My career would be over." Joshua emerged from the station. "Dr. Santos, your gear is loaded. We need to head out in 10 minutes to stay on schedule." "Coming," I called back. Eliana grabbed my arm. "Wait, you can't just drop this on me and leave." "I don't have a choice, but you do. You can request immediate extraction if you want. Just know they'll want to know why." She looked at the station, then back at me. "I need this assignment. Then follow the rules. They've kept me alive." We walked together toward the helicopter. Joshua was checking something on the exterior of the aircraft, his back to us. "One more thing," I said. "The phenomena stopped last night. Nothing happened during my final 24 hours here. I think they know when we're leaving." Eliana swallowed hard, but nodded. I climbed aboard the helicopter while Joshua helped Eliana with the last of her supplies. As I buckled myself in, I looked back at the station one last time. My breath caught in my throat. In one of the windows, the lab window, I saw a figure standing perfectly still, a figure wearing an Antarctic Research Foundation uniform with no face where a face should be. I blinked, and it vanished. Joshua climbed into the pilot's seat. "Ready to go home, Dr. Santos?" I couldn't answer for a moment. I watched Eliana walking toward the station entrance, the envelope with the rules clutched tightly in her hand. "Dr. Santos? All good back there?" "Yes," I finally managed. "Let's go." The helicopter lifted off, snow swirling beneath us. I watched as the station grew smaller, Eliana's red parka visible until she disappeared inside. The cluster of red buildings that had been my prison for 6 months shrank until it was just a speck on the vast white expanse. As we flew over the Transantarctic mountain range, I knew I would never fully understand what I had encountered in that frozen wasteland. The faceless figures, the knocking, the music, the claw marks, they defied scientific explanation. But I had survived by trusting the wisdom of those who came before me. Now I could only hope Eliana would do the same.